Aloha all. This week we're delving more deeply into the differential risks and impacts of disasters according to race, ethnicity, minority status, and an indigenous status as well. There are two readings for this week. First is Andrew Baum's Toxins, Technology, and Natural Disasters, and it considers a lot of the factors relating to technological disasters, including psychological factors and the shared characteristics of impact and vulnerability across different types of disasters. This vulnerability includes the lack of power and lack of resources, and how that prevents people from being out of the way of disasters. Second, we have Raquel Penderhues, The Impact of Race on Environmental Quality, and it shows how we have a history of systematically placing poor, brown people in the line of fire, so to speak, of potential disasters. This is an example of systemic racism. Now, it may be that someone chose to create toxic environments in the backyards of minorities. This is not necessarily true for all cases, but it may be true for any case. What is definitely true is that people who are marginalized or oppressed in some way in a society do not have the political or economic power to stop something like this from happening in their backyards. So this is why it's an example of systemic racism, because there may or may not be a person or people who purposefully are doing this, but it is definitely the racist power structure that is systematically perpetuating the racist power structure. So these readings, Penderhues in particular, are very difficult. They're heartbreaking, and this is not by any stretch of the imagination a fun topic to explore, but it is important that we consider that we learn about how race, ethnicity, and minority status might affect, theoretically, climate change outcomes, but also how it is definitely, currently, continuously affecting vulnerabilities. Now, one of the common characteristics between natural disasters and technological disasters is that people who are marginalized in some way, for example, because of racism or poverty or both, will be more vulnerable than others. In a natural disaster scenario, we often see that marginalized or oppressed peoples may live on land that is less stable, more vulnerable, or poorer in some way, but they also have lesser access to resources for resistance to the disaster and also for recovery from the disaster. And they have other issues that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, obstacles in their everyday lives that non-oppressed people do not also have to contend with after they're recovering from a disaster. So I'll talk a little bit more about this later. The difference, however, in a technological disaster scenario, all of these things are also true, but in addition to that, there's also the possibility that someone in the power hierarchy somewhere assessed that there is a risk associated with this technology, and that risk was acceptable to others. You don't often see CEOs of chemical companies living near their plants, drinking the groundwater, exposing themselves or their children to potential factory explosions or spills or what have you. But they have assessed, or they may have assessed, that that risk is acceptable for others. So this brings in an extra issue of intent that is not present with natural disasters. Not only is society not providing care or some support to its most vulnerable members, but they may also be actively placing them in harm's way. Now, this is also the case with climate change. Because climate change is such a broad, far-reaching thing, it's something that is occurring not really on purpose. We didn't set out to change the climate, but we are continuing to, pollute the environment with tons and tons of CO2 from our industries, from our cars, from all of these things. We are continuing to use this fuel, even though we know that it is causing this damage to the environment, and particularly to most vulnerable populations around the world. So that's something to consider. It doesn't come up in our readings since, of course, they are focused specifically on disasters that have already occurred, but it's something that we can definitely cross over with our psychology of climate change. Now, I mentioned earlier that part of disaster vulnerability is lesser access to resources and greater prevalence of everyday obstacles. In general, in sweeping terms, ethnic and racial minorities are more likely to also be dealing with poverty due to history and presence of systemic racism that prohibits them and prohibited their forebears from taking advantage of opportunities that are open to other people. So we have to consider differential access to resources more fully. This brings us to conservation of resources theory, or CORE theory, C-O-R theory. This is not in your readings, but it's a psychological theory that was developed by Stephen Hobfall. It states that people's primary motivation in life is to obtain and maintain those resources that they most value. So people obtain resources by investing other resources. This may be literal. For example, I invest my money in order to buy a car, or it can also be figurative resources or non-tangential or non-tangible resources. So, for example, I invest my time and my kindness in order to develop friendships and social supports. To my knowledge, core theory has not been applied to disasters before. It's mostly been used for stress, worker burnout, things like that. I have applied core theory in my research to motivations for community activism, and I think that it can be pretty easily applied to disaster recovery. So when our valued resources are threatened, as part of the theory, we feel stress because we invest our resources and we have to invest even more resources after there is a threat or a loss to those things that we have. We have to invest even more in order to maintain or to regain what has been lost. In disaster terms, if I lose my house, I'm going to need to invest my life savings or my retirement fund in order to recover from that disaster. An obvious corollary to this is that people who have more resources are better able to recover from disaster or from some sort of loss. But the core theory also states that initial loss begets further loss. Once you experience a loss, you have less resources than you did before, which makes it more difficult to recover from that loss, but it also makes it more difficult just to maintain your status quo, like how you are living your everyday standard of life. If a disaster happens and I lose my house, what if I don't have a life savings or a retirement fund in order to recover from that? And if I don't have clothes to wear for work, if I lost everything that was in that house, if I'm spending so much time and effort trying to put my life back together after a disaster, maybe I'm missing work, maybe I lose my job. And in addition to also being poor, if I also have systemic or overt racism that is blocking me in every step of the way, every day becomes more difficult than the day before it. Hobfall calls this a spiral of loss, and spirals of loss like these can make it extremely difficult to recover after a disaster. So I have one more final note before I release you for the week. This is both a word of praise and an apology to the class. I have set very high expectations for this class. It's a 400 level class, and I don't think it's the sort of class that you would join if you're not already pretty interested in the topic. So I expect a lot out of you, and every week as a class you have met and exceeded my expectations. I'm constantly impressed by this class. So there's my word of praise, and now for my apology is even with my high expectations, I feel like I have underestimated you. When I was grading the Week 4 discussions, I was so very highly impressed by the questions that you all posed and the subsequent responses, the discussions that you had, that I realized that I was underestimating you. I figured that there would be interesting discussion when I posed that, just ask your own questions, but I also thought that some of you might be feeling a little lost with some of the topics, and that being able to ask questions of your own might help you get found through class discussion. But when I read the topics that were posed, when I read the discussion that you had, I realized that I think I've been holding you back with my research questions, with my discussion questions, even as broad as I've tried to make them. So from this week on, there will always be an open topic in the discussion forum, so that you can broach all of the subjects that you are thinking about, that you're considering, that tie into your own term paper and your research. Some weeks I may also have a guided question or a guided topic, as I have in previous weeks, but there will always be, from here on out, you will always have a chance to discuss what it is that you're considering. So, great job everyone, and I will see you online.